Welcome. Oh my goodness. How exciting. Just very quickly before we get started, in the spirit of reconciliation, Belongside Families acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Pam, and I'm joining you today from the land of the Ngunnawal people. So, welcome to our medical information sessions. I'm pretty excited about this one actually. It's very on point and age appropriate for my guy. And I'm really super excited to hear all of Nat's expertise. So we are going to hear from Natalie from Children's Nursing Queensland, our favourite expert. And she's going to share her knowledge and some really helpful information around preparing for puberty. So before I hand over to Natalie, I'm just going to very quickly cover some housekeeping to ensure that we all get the most out of today's session. So today's session is going to run for approximately 30 minutes. I do apologize for the delay starting, but it will try and get as much information to you guys as possible. So this session is being recorded, and everyone who has registered for the session will receive a link to the recording. And Nat has very kindly agreed to share her slides with us. So you'll receive a copy of the slides with that email as well. For technical support, please use the chat function along the bottom. And if you have any questions about the content or specifically for Nat, please just use the question and answer box, and we will address those question and answer questions that come through that box if there's time at the end of the session. So as mentioned, this session is being recorded for future viewing, so just please be really mindful of this when you're asking questions and engaging in the chat. I will if the question is too personal, and we might generalize it a little bit just to try and get information to people without compromising confidentiality or anything like that. Please refrain from taking screenshots or making your own recordings. But I think we're good to go. I'm going to hand over to Natalie. I'm so
excited. Also apologise for technical issues. We joke all the time that we think we're pretty good nurses, but technology is an area we are still not experts in. And we need all of these teenagers to grow up and become tech experts so that they can fix all of these issues for us. Hi, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Pam. My name is Nat. I'm a nurse and stomal therapist from Children's Nursing Queensland, and we're talking today about puberty, which I think is a very interesting topic in this space. You know, we always seem to get a lot of questions and we don't seem to have a lot of answers for some of those questions. So it'll be interesting to hear everybody's thoughts and to hear from you guys as well. Just to get started, we are working fantastic. Just to sort of say who we are and sort of what we do. Myself and Lisa, who you see in the lovely photo there, are both stomal therapists, and our sort of area of specialty is supporting children with complex medical conditions or disability in lots of different areas. As stomal therapists, we kind of joke we're the pee, poo, pus and peg nurses, but we also end up in this sort of interesting space around puberty. And I think it's just because by nature, continence is kind of a bit of a tricky kind of subject. And with that sort of comes all of those other kind of tricky questions. So we do get a lot of questions about puberty, not just from parents, but from young people as well. So hopefully I can answer some questions today about what's normal and what might not be normal, or about things that might be sort of similar for children going through puberty, and then some sort of unique considerations we might have as parents or nurses looking after children who might have some additional care requirements. So I think talking about puberty, you know, there's a lot of things that are going to be the same. And we all know puberty is a really tricky time for everybody in the house involved. You know, there's so many things that can go on. And it's just about arming ourselves with the right information to be able to tackle maybe some of those tricky questions or tricky situations that might sort of arise. So something that is the same, whether or not you're raising a child that has disabilities or medical conditions or is neurotypical or is typically developing, these sorts of things are all the same. So when we think about puberty, we need to make sure that all of the young people we support have access to the right sort of developmentally appropriate information. And that's going to look really different for each person, but it's really a kind of key in keeping that child safe and informed. Information is best to come from parents and healthcare providers. And so, having that combination, not just one person being that sole source of information, is really important because sometimes we get questions as healthcare providers that maybe children or young people don't feel comfortable asking their parents. And we also get questions from parents that they don't feel comfortable kind of having chats with their young people as well about. So I think having information from all sources is really important. And when we do that and we give information, we help to avoid risky sexual situations for those young people. And we can help just make sure everyone's on a sort of equal playing ground where they start with that information. The other thing that is the same is mood fluctuations. So we hear a lot of the time from parents, they don't know why all of a sudden their 10 or 11-year-old is starting to have these big changes in how they feel and how they act. That's going to be the same whether or not you've got a typically developing child or a child without medical conditions. It's the same across the board. But there are some differences. So if you're raising a child that has medical conditions, these are some of the differences that you might notice. So the first is that some of those kind of medical or physical anomalies might change development. And that really depends for every single person. You know, we support a wide range of children and young people that might be the 1 in 500 in the world, or 1 in 50, or 1 in none. And so it really comes down to understanding what those anomalies are and how they might change development. And typically, your child's medical team is going to be the right person to sort of think about how those changes might impact on puberty. Will probably need some different supports to understand puberty. So a lot of the people that we look after might have cognitive impairments, or they might have issues with communication. So they might just need different ways to understand what puberty is and how those changes might impact their bodies. I think the big thing is we might not have all the answers. I would love to say that we had all the answers, but even in preparing for this talk today, looking through the kind of available information out there, you can't just look up in a textbook, will this happen to my child, and find that answer. And I think, most of the parents that you support, Pam, probably have heard that before, that we don't have all the answers for everything because resources are limited. So, it's about trying to have those conversations early with your healthcare professional and try and arm yourself from an early sort of developmental approach so that we can understand as they're going through what that looks like. The other thing that is important to note is that children with disabilities or medical conditions may be at a high risk of sexual abuse. And that comes down to lots of reasons. It's the intimate nature of some of the cares that we provide, it's communication deficits, it's intellectual impairments. And so because of that, we really want to make sure that we are having these conversations in a way that is developmentally appropriate. And we're putting some of those sort of protective factors in place. The other thing is that the children that we support, because of their medical conditions or disabilities, might be at high risk of things like spasticity or seizures, or bowel changes that can happen when they go through puberty. And so often we'll do, a continence assessment with somebody with, say, spina bifida, and they've been trudging along and everything's been going great. And then they go through puberty and all of a sudden there's these big changes that sort of occur. And sometimes they change sort of ongoing for that young person, or sometimes they just change while they get their periods, for example, or while they're going through periods of puberty and then they kind of settle down. And so there's not much we can do about that because we might not understand what that trajectory looks like. It's just knowing that those differences can happen, and that if they happen, you don't have to just accept them. You can talk to your healthcare team about ways that we can help support some of those changes that might be occurring. Probably the big thing that we talk about is precocious puberty. So a lot of people aren't aware that if you have a child that has certain medical conditions or disabilities, that they may go through precocious puberty, which is basically when they go through puberty a little bit younger than what is typical of children that age. So there's lots of sort of medical terms around it, but essentially it's before the age of 8 for girls and before the age of 9 for boys, where they develop their secondary sexual characteristics. More common in females, and I found this fact really interesting, is that following the COVID-19 pandemic, we actually hit another rise of precocious puberty again, which is attributed to lots of different things like reduced mobility, increases in obesity, issues with sleep and changes in circadian rhythm, and a few other factors. So, because of that, this precocious puberty means we have to start thinking and planning about how to support our young people sort of earlier than we ever did before. So if you're thinking that your child might be one of those people that is going through precocious puberty, I think it's always worth having a chat with your healthcare team about it. Sometimes they might think about referring to an endocrinologist for a hormonal assessment or doing an MRI if there's no known cause, but typically they're able to have a little bit of a chat about it and see if there's a reason for it before then. Periods is another very interesting one. So typically, we start to get our periods about 2 to 3 years after our breasts develop. But if we've gone through precocious puberty, which we've spoken about, that can obviously happen a little bit earlier. Sometimes it can be a bit later in our young people that we support as well, because they might have differences with malnutrition, or they might be on some medications like some high dose steroids that can cause them to start their cycle later. Probably the big questions we get as nurses is how their parents can support young people on their periods. And so we find things like the choice of products that they use is a really tricky one for some people. If they're incontinence aids, typically they'll continue to use those and just change them a little bit more frequently. But sometimes the children that we support or young people that we support aren't wearing continence aids. And so we have to think about what are their sensory preferences with choosing products. We get a lot of people now who like reusable options, but whether or not they're going to be able to be washed easily. There's lots of things to think about there. So we try to make it a real shared decision making process with the young person and their family about how we can best support that. And often there's lots of trials as well. So, we don't always just accept the first thing we try. We try to talk to families about what options are available for them to try. For some of our young people, we don't want them to have their periods for whatever reason, whether it's to do with hygiene or other issues as well. So sometimes your doctor might talk to you about suppressing menstruation or giving your child some form of medication to stop them having their periods. And that's a really good conversation to have with your healthcare professional if you're thinking about that. Hygiene's a big one. We all know about smelly teenage boys and girls. It happens. We start to get these body odors and they can be so hard to shift. And so really cleaning and hygiene cares are so important, particularly for our young people that might not be able to do that themselves and they might rely on carers. So sometimes it's just having chats about making sure that regime is really done properly. Sometimes we might talk about things like trimming pubic hair if we need to do that to keep them clean and to minimize, issues when we're doing perianal cares and that sort of thing. And a lot of parents do that. They just don't talk about it. And it's okay to do as long as you're doing it safely. So with clippers or something like that is fine. If you've got a young person who's really reluctant to get in the shower for sensory aversions or it's just a challenging process, you can also look into some alternative hygiene products. So there's things like microwavable bed bath wipes that you can chuck in the microwave. They're nice and warm and they hold heat a little bit better than sometimes just your old flannel and water. Or shampoo caps is another great one that we can use for our children that have difficulties washing their hair. So have a chat with your nurse if you feel as though some of those products would be useful, or with your OT if you feel like some of those barriers might involve changes in equipment and that sort of thing that could be useful. The other thing we spoke about already a little bit was about continence and the fact that things like bowel and bladder function can change a lot when we start our periods, as do compliance. We have a large cohort of young people who do things like catheters or transanal irrigation, and that might have been working really well. And then they go through puberty and all of a sudden they want to be like their peers. They don't want to do that anymore. And so compliance then becomes a bit of an issue, even with things like just changing their continence aids. In those times, that's a hard conversation to have. And sometimes it's better to have it from healthcare professionals as well. But it's all about how we can improve choice and control for that young person and how we can support them through that. So we respect their decision, but we still offer them some choices about how they can manage things safely. So having the conversation, this is really the key kind of part of it. And that conversation really should be starting quite young. And it doesn't mean you have to tell that young person absolutely everything about, sex and puberty and everything that comes with it. It's sometimes just about doing it in small little chunks that are absorbable and easy to understand. So make sure that you have a chat with your healthcare professional about the best way that you can support your child through that if you don't feel comfortable in doing it. The big thing that we can do, which we know is a massive protective factor, is to use anatomically correct language. So we talk about vaginas and penises and, anuses. It's not, your private places. It's not your, I don't know, woohoo. We hear all sorts of funny names for our vaginas and penises and everything that comes along with it. So use the correct terminology, even if you've got a nonverbal child, and make sure that you're supporting that terminology when you're having those conversations with other people as well. And we think having those conversations early, around 8 to 9, is the best sort of age to be doing that. And that's what the researchers suggest as well. And find out together, because it's really hard to do this alone. It can be hard to find resources as well. And so often, having a look at those resources and then bringing them to your child when you've had a look through them first is a good way to do that. These are some of the resources we've found that have been really useful, and we refer on to these often when we're supporting families. So Planet Puberty is excellent. It's probably the first one that I encourage families to have a little bit of a look at. A lot of these are designed for young people that might have intellectual impairments, or they might be neurodiverse. They might understand things a little bit differently. And so not all of these are going to be appropriate to every single person. But Planet Puberty in general has some really great resources, and it has them in a way that, they have different sorts of forms of resources. So they have your printouts, they have podcasts, they have games. So that can be a really good place to have a look through. And it's all free as well to access. Some other ones you can look at is the Looking After Me program. So they're more workshops, which you can use your NDIS funding to access, and they're designed to work with that young person and their parent or guardian to talk about those specific issues. So it's a much more individualized approach, and I think they run them over about 4 different sessions, and it's more of a, I guess, intensive part. Might not be super suitable for our younger kids, but definitely as they go through puberty and start to explore, sexual health and that sort of thing, it's a really good thing to look into. And then other things that you can even just, if you're comfortable having those conversations about things like paper dolls, there's some wonderful ones out there that are all anatomically correct, and you can print them out and talk about body parts in a way that uses that developmentally appropriate language, and it's easy to understand for our more visual learners. So that's some of the references from today's talk that we've gone through today. Like I said, there's not a huge amount out there, so I think this is such an emerging place still to be in. And it's definitely getting out there. We're starting to learn more and more about it, but I'm happy to sort of answer any questions if anybody has any for us today. I'm not sure if I've got any that have come through,
Just very
Pam.
quickly, one's come through in the chat. She noted the shampoo cap, but what was the first alternative hygiene product that you mentioned?
The microwavable bed bath wipes, it's a big mouthful. They're fantastic. There's lots of brands that do them. They're not super expensive, and a lot of the time, if you've got NDIS, you can get those funded too. Most of the time, they're a pack, and the idea is that you put that entire pack in the microwave, heat them up, and then you'd use one wipe for an arm, another wipe for the other arm, and you'd use up that whole pack of about 8 wipes by the time you finish. So a great little product to try. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. And we do have a question in the Q&A box. And you did touch on this slightly, but maybe you could share some more information. So her question is around like periods and nappies and all of that kind of stuff. So her daughter hasn't yet started her period. But she's kind of wondering if the use of a contraceptive that would skip periods is an option, or do they need to go through puberty fully first prior to using a product like that?
I think they're very great questions that are probably a little bit above my my scope. I think they're good questions to have with your doctor, because it's so different for everybody. Sometimes, some children may have been prescribed puberty blockers in the past. They may not be doing that so frequently here in Queensland with law changes and, lots of other things. But, contraceptive pills, things like the depot shot, there's lots of options out there. And it's really going to be dependent on each individual child and family and what those risk factors are and their medical conditions and disabilities and things like that. So a great question. I'm sorry, I don't have the answer for that one, but a good thing to have a chat with your medical professional about. Yeah.
Beautiful. If anyone has any other questions for Nat, please pop them in the Q&A right now, while we're waiting for anyone to come up with some things. Are there any common misconceptions that parents should be aware of regarding puberty in children with disabilities?
I think the biggest misconception is we don't need to talk about it because, they may not be thinking about sex in the future. And I think we have to think about the here and now and focus on where children are now, meet them where they are at the moment. But there's still questions, and we're all still curious beings. We all still have lots of questions about why these changes might be happening in our bodies or why we feel certain things. And just creating that open space just allows children to have the opportunity to ask questions. So, um, just starting a conversation, I think, is always the first bit. The common misconception is we don't need to have it. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. And we do have another question that's popped up in the Q&A. And this is in no way a silly question. There's no such thing as a silly question. So the question is there a way to prevent period pain? So for context, it's for a nonverbal child that's not able to tell us where the pain is coming from.
That's such a tricky one. And sometimes we don't recognize it might be pain. So kudos to this parent who's asked it. Sometimes we think that their behaviors just get worse and we don't recognize that actually pain comes in
Yeah.
lots of different ways. I don't think there's any different ways to manage pain, period pain, than there is for other young girls who might have period pain. I think having those chats with the doctors are always going to be a good thing to look into because there's pharmacological and non-pharmacological ways that we can support it. It's going to be really dependent on each individual. So obviously those non-pharmacological things that we can do to support it would be heat packs and warmth and massage and those sorts of things. But the pharmacological way may vary from child to child or young person to young person, depending on their condition too, because there's lots of different pain options out there. Yeah. Periods shouldn't be super painful. I think as women, we often accept that, but they shouldn't be a super painful thing for girls to go through. So if there is lots of pain, sometimes the medical professionals do want to do a little bit more investigation in case there's something going on.
Yeah, beautiful. And you did mention that there is very limited resources available, and you've listed some incredible ones, but is there anything that kind of outlines like a bit of a step by step of the stages of puberty and like kind of what we might expect
Yeah, yeah.
what comes next?
I think probably that Planet Puberty one's a great place to start for that real
Yeah.
basic information. It may not all be super applicable to each individual that we're talking to today or we're talking about, but I think it's a good place to start. And then that in conjunction with your medical team will help you form a really educated way to, I guess, handle it because we've all been through it, but it's still something, tricky and it's different for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So individualized, isn't it?
it is. Absolutely.
Um, that's kind of, I think we've covered all of the things I had that I wanted to
Excellent.
ask you. If no one else has any other questions, we might wrap up. Thank you so much, Nat. As always, it's so informative and engaging, and you just are full of such incredible information. I always learn so much when we chat with you. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day to share all of that with us. We really, really
Yes.
appreciate it. Um, and so, in coming days, everyone will receive a link with the recording from today. Nat is kindly going to share her slides. So all of those resources and the links that we saw in her presentation will also be attached to your email. Nat's contact information will also be there. So if you've got any like more specific things that you would like her expert opinion on, you'll be able to contact her. And as always, there'll be a few different ways that you can stay in contact and keep the conversation going within the Belongside Families community, which we're so incredibly grateful for your presence in. So you can stay connected with us via all the usual channels on social media. Make sure you've subscribed to our newsletter to keep informed of all of the different events that we have coming up. So thank you again, everyone, Nat, and everyone who's sat through this beautiful presentation. I really appreciate you all sharing your time with us today. I hope I see you again at another event in the not so distant future. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Everybody.
Enjoy the long weekend.
Thank you. See you.
See you.